and the rest of the.
Hello, my name is Al Haddad. I am an undergrad here at CU Boulder in computer science.
Hi everyone, I'm Kenji. I'm a PhD student at University of California, Los Angeles, studying plant ecology.
Hello everyone, my name is Vasuki. I'm a second year PhD student at University of Florida, Gainesville. I study soils.
And I think we might have one team member who couldn't make it today.
Okay, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about biodiversity and ecosystem function, predicting resistance to wildfire from spectral diversity. Next slide, please. With changing land use and land cover, as well as changing disturbance, we're facing a crisis of ecological function. And not to overestimate the importance of this issue, but ecological function underpins all life on Earth, human and otherwise. Biological diversity has long been posited as critical to maintaining ecosystem function. And a biodiversity ecosystem function relationship, or BDEF, has been demonstrated across a range of conditions. There are extensive studies demonstrating that ecosystem function is decreasing as the number of species in a community decreases. But given the intensive nature of field sampling, we're limited in our ability to measure biological diversity and ecosystem function from the ground across really large spatial scales. But data derived from satellites, including spectral information and structural information, are spatially extensive, which allows for analyses that yield generalizable results given sufficient compute power. So one way to categorize biological diversity at large scales is the spectral species concept, where species categories or clusters or classes are defined by spectra rather than more traditional methods like taxonomic or phylogenetic diversity, in which species are defined in part by their genetic relationships. So using a spectral species concept will allow us to explore this biodiversity ecosystem function relationship at ecosystem relevant scales. Next slide, and Vasuki.
Thanks, Megan. So another rationale behind this proposal is that a particularly promising avenue for inquiry can be the relationship between biological diversity and ecosystem stability, a class of ecosystem function, which has demonstrated at small spatial extent and an experimental condition. So as an example of an ecosystem stability is the resistance to fire. We have presented in the slide deck across decades how wildfire events occurred in the United States over a period of 5 decades. It would be great to see how it has societal benefit to understand how this biological diversity affects resistance to fire, which is especially important as we consider how extensive wildfire impacts are across the US, especially in the west coast of the US. Next slide, please.
So the main objective of our proposal here is to explore this biodiversity ecosystem function relationship at these really large spatial scales using an environmental data cube as a means to get there. And specifically, the question that we're asking is how does biodiversity, which in this case we're characterizing at scale as spectral diversity from satellite remote sensing, how does this confer resistance to wildfires? So that's our one focal metric of ecosystem functioning here, although of course we can expand that in the future. Building on what we've already talked about, the main hypothesis that we're going to be examining is that areas with higher spectral diversity, more spectral species in terms of vegetation, are going to be more resistant to wildfires or have reduced severity of wildfires through that biological diversity that might confer sort of different strategies that can help resist wildfires. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Kenji. And here's the data that we used. Moving from left to right, we have our RGB data and the multispectral bands. The multispectral bands were taken from the Sentinel-2 data provided to us by the hackathon. And on the far right, we have our ecoregion, the Western Cordillera ecoregion, which we thought would be particularly of interest because they really got lit up by fires during our designated time period of 2021. Our data for fires was taken from MTBS, or the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity mosaics for 2021. So we were able to see not only these fire polygons in our data, but the severity of the burns themselves. The spectral data we fed into our data cube and specifically constrained both data sets to the ecoregion of the Western Cordillera ecoregion. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so for our preliminary analyses, we leveraged the data cube and the massive computational resources provided to us, and we ran a k-means unsupervised clustering algorithm on particularly our spectral data to designate our spectral species. After a bit of tinkering, we found that 50 clusters was the best based on our evaluation metrics. And we have our visualization here with red light on the x-axis and near infrared on the y-axis. And each of those different colors represents a different cluster of a spectral species. This would then be applied using a moving window technique, particularly taking a 3x3 pixel grid and looking at the adjacencies for 1 pixel and counting the number of distinct spectral species within that window. We could then use that as a metric of spectral diversity and compare it with our burn severity. 3x3 is obviously tentative, and we would have to experiment a bit more before arriving on a final conclusion for what window would be best for us. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so the core of what we're really proposing here, which is still forthcoming work, is to model this relationship between spectral diversity and fire severity. We do believe that this is a question that lends itself particularly well to something like a supervised machine learning approach, such as regression. One possibility that we have floated regarding this would be to apply something like a Bayesian, perhaps hierarchical model that takes into account inherent spatial structure on Earth. And also part of the motivation here would be to sort of accommodate this uncertainty that exists, because by doing so, we believe we can bring a probabilistic and hopefully more interpretable assessment that could be brought to the table for discussion with stakeholders and managers in this decision-making process when it comes to wildfire management. One thing we also wanted to mention, getting ahead of myself. One thing we're excited to propose here actually is to build on this this moving window approach for assessing or quantifying spectral diversity, and combining what we have here with a slightly perhaps less supervised variable selection algorithm to identify the spatial scales basically at which spectral diversity has the strongest connection to our metric of ecosystem functioning. I also want to mention that this pipeline that we're outlining here, we believe it really has the potential to be put to use for improving prediction as well, in addition to understanding what's going on. And especially we can do that by leveraging high performance computing and the fact that there's really a continuous data stream when it comes to the satellite data, fire occurrences. And in addition to that, new data can also be in the form of different metrics of ecosystem function, such as things like net primate productivity. Next slide, please.
As Kenji alluded to, in addition to modeling wildfire resistance as a function of spectral diversity, which is a stability measure of ecosystem function, We could also apply this framework to other measures of both biological diversity, things like structure that can be derived from satellite data, as well as to other measures of ecosystem function itself, things like stocks, like soil carbon perhaps, or flux, like net primary productivity. And that makes this framework relevant across multiple disciplines and sectors related to ecosystem function and even ecosystem service provision. Next slide.
Yeah. Overall, the idea behind these research question is to come up with an open source data pipeline and the building of a data product that can serve as base for several other research questions. And our results will also allow for targeted interventions to manage biodiversity in areas with most potential impact of this ecosystem function. For dissemination point of view, it allows for collaboration across disciplines, enabling transdisciplinary collaboration, involving stakeholders to identify priorities and integrate into existing decision support to make policies. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening, and we want to thank the EASL team in particular for all the support. And we're ready for questions.
Thank you. Wow, what a powerful framework. Love it. Congratulations, guys. We have a few minutes for questions.
Yep. I think I can start then. So I'm not sure if this spectral diverse predicts very well functional diverse and other kind of trait related diverse metrics that could be more related to the occurrence of fires. It's not I'm not sure, I just don't know. So I would like to know if you have any kind of evidence that could tie them to this resistance to fire. And if not, is there any way of using other kind of data sets that you could integrate with this spectral diversity and to be more accurate about the functions of the species that are in those places?
Yeah, I could take that one. Yeah, that's a really good question and a really good point. These relationships are somewhat unknown. There's been some studies that have examined the relationship between NDVI and some measures of fire resistance or resilience. And one kind of question in that paper was looking at the spatial scale at which those relationships are relevant. And so there's some preliminary evidence that supports this idea, and NDVI being a much more simple metric and application of spectra. We think there's some extreme value added in including spectral species rather than just looking at one sort of index of plant health, but also incorporating structural information into this. For example, structural information that we could gather through JEDI would give us some unique insight to the combination of spectral diversity and structural diversity that would influence things like resistance to wildfire. And of course, this is dependent on ecosystem type and what the historical range of variation of fire characteristics might look like in a given ecosystem type. So ultimately including that information into the supervised component of our AI application, looking at actual relationships between the biodiversity and ecosystem function would be pretty critical.
Can I add on to that as well? Yeah, so one more thing that I think could be interesting on that front is we are focusing on spectral diversity here because there is the ecological sort of basis for thinking about biodiversity ecosystem function relationships. But I think one of the cool things that comes out of using this sort of clustering approach to identify unique spectral characteristics is that perhaps there are some communities or some trees perhaps that do confer higher resistance to fire. And to the extent that we can identify what are the clusters or what are the spectral species that provide that, in addition to diversity, we can also sort of pinpoint like what are the differences in the vegetation there that make it more or less resistant to fire, perhaps. I think.
Hi, I think it might be my turn to ask a question. I was curious about how the team thought about scale in this regard. You talked about thinking about at what scale does biodiversity and ecosystem function have the strongest relationship. And I wondered if you always thought of that as sort of the same grain size, or if sort of the scale of biodiversity measurement might be at a different sort of grain size than the scale or the grain size of the ecosystem function measurement, because that it may be that, I mean, you know, for example, animals move around the landscape, so there could be sort of different scales of these two measurements that would result in the highest relationship. Was my thinking. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Thanks.
I don't want to keep jumping in if someone else from the team wants to answer, but I'm happy to. Okay. Yeah, Andrew, I think you really hit the nail on the head there with regards to the spatial scale being tied to some ecologically meaningful process or pattern, and there's some sort of mechanistic explanation for why scale might matter. And for some of these ecosystem functions, multiple scales could interact and be relevant. And so I think that's one reason the AI is so powerful here in looking at what spatial scale, when we're quantifying spectral diversity, the AI is so powerful because it allows us to take into account those multiple scales and sort of determine what scale and what combination of scales and interactions of scales might best explain that or best predict that relationship between the spectral or structural diversity and the ecosystem function of interest. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks.
In addition, I would hope that we could cross-validate this spectral data with pre-existing notions of diversity in areas, and I think that we could better evaluate our model and better tweak our model in the future.
I was just going to ask a quick question about future stakeholders that you might engage that you mentioned at the end, and who that might be and what that looks like.
I might jump in again briefly. I had imagined as stakeholders were the public at large, because these fires, we've been seeing it a lot, especially I see your CU Boulder background. We've been seeing it in our area. You know, it's these fires are a human problem now. It isn't just the environment. And I think that the stakeholders would be local governments. It would be these communities who are disproportionately affected by this, and really teaching them to care about these sort of things.
Go ahead, Kenji. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and I think just building off the engagement with people and managers, I think one of the things that we wanted to emphasize from this is that not perfectly, but to some extent, we do have the capacity to sort of intervene and sort of manage what kinds of trees or vegetation exists in a place. Where do we protect, prioritize protection? How do we prioritize protection of diversity within a forest? These are actionable things that I think hopefully from this can be, brought to the broader public in making decisions.
And I'll just add to that, one kind of specific stakeholder that I think would be really relevant for us to engage in would be the Forest Service, particularly given their restoration initiatives that have recently been amped up. And so we're proposing here more of a transdisciplinary or co-production approach, where we don't assume a priori what specific output of our model would be most relevant and most helpful for decision-making on the ground. So we ideally would like to have a couple of stakeholder meetings with, for example, the Forest Service. The BLM is another group that I think could potentially benefit from outputs of these models, and ask, what specific outputs are useful to you? At what scale? Can we deliver our output and or our data in a way that allows you to integrate it into existing decision support tools? So, for example, where I live in Idaho, the Idaho Department of Lands has a geospatial interface that they use to make decisions about the grant distribution for wildfire response grants that they make. And so including some of our geospatial outputs, for example, into that existing geospatial database might be one way that we can get this information into the hands of managers who are actually undergoing restoration activities on the ground.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Congratulations.